Our special guest today is Professor Peter Boxall. And good afternoon, Professor Boxall, and good morning and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. So time to formally introduce Professor Boxall, who is Professor of English at the University of Sussex. He has written books on Samuel Beckett, on Don DeLillo, and several books on the novel, including 21st-century fiction and the value of the novel. His most recent book, The Prosthetic Imagination, A History of the Novel as Artificial Life, which is also the subject of our discussion today, came out with CUP in 2020. He has edited a range of work, including a collection on Beckett's politics, entitled Beckett Aesthetics Politics, a collection on poetry entitled Thinking Poetry with Peter Nicholls, 1001 Books You Must Read Before You Die, the Cambridge Companion to British Fiction, 1980 to 2018, and a Faber edition of Beckett's novel Malone Dies. He is also co-editor of Volume 7 of the Oxford History of the Novel with Bryan Cheyette, editor of the book series Cambridge Studies in 21st Century Literature and Culture, and editor of the UK journal Textual Practice. He is currently writing a book on the 20th century novel and the current crisis in Western culture, entitled Fictions of the West. It's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Boxall.
Well, can I just say before we go on, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to talking.
Thank you so much, and thank you for agreeing to be part of this interview. It was such a pleasant surprise. So in our discussion today on novels, prosthetic, embodied, posthuman, we will try to locate the essence of Professor Boxall's intriguing book, The Prosthetic Imagination. And for the audience, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. They will be taken up towards the end of the session. So let me jump straight in with my first question. So Professor Boxall, let us begin with the mutually interdependent concepts of mimesis and prosthesis, with which you start your book. So when we consider mimesis, even in the Aristotelian sense, do we refer to it as a biological process, or mimetic acts as having a primal inheritance of the primates copying nature and animals? Or is prosthesis then mimesis by extension?
Prosthesis is mimesis by extension. That's a very helpful way of thinking about it, I think. And you're talking about primates copying other animals or copying nature. Of course, I think we copy ourselves. So the mimetic process by which we copy ourselves is also the prosthetic process by which we extend into the world. I mean, so another way of getting at this question or problem or thought form would be to recognize that we are not naturally at home in ourselves. We always have to try to be like ourselves. And a place where I think we can see this very clearly, and if you'll allow me, I'll read from it, is a moment at the beginning of Shakespeare's play Hamlet, where we can see mimesis and prosthesis at work or vibrating against one another in the process by which we try to be like ourselves. Or we prosthetize ourselves in trying to be like ourselves. And at the moment I'm thinking of, I don't know if most of us have this play in our minds. The moment I'm thinking of is when Marcellus, Bernardo, and Horatio, at the opening of the play Hamlet, are going to wait for the ghost of Hamlet's father to appear. Bernardo and Marcellus have already seen the ghost, and they've got Horatio along to say, look, Horatio, I think there's this ghost around. You're going to have to go and tell Hamlet. So, you draw the short straw, having to tell Hamlet that the ghost of his dad is stalking the ramparts. So, and that's how the play opens. The question, the immediate question they address, the three of them, is whether the ghost is Hamlet's father, or whether the ghost is like Hamlet's father, which is this question around prosthesis or imitation, Asijit, in your opening question. And this is how it goes. Bernardo, the ghost is there, they're looking at the ghost. Bernardo says to Horatio, "How now, Horatio, you tremble and look pale. Is this not something more than fantasy? What think you on it?" Horatio says, "Before my God, I might not this believe without the sensible and true avouch of mine own eyes." And Marcellus, and this is the line I want us to think about. Marcellus says to Horatio, "Is it not like the king?" And Horatio's response, "As thou art to thyself, as thou art to thyself." And the beautiful part of that line, or what makes that line so interesting to me, is that it's entirely contradictory, self-contradictory around the play between mimesis and prosthesis. In that what the rhetorical weight of that line, "as thou art to thyself," is Horatio saying, yes, the king is very like, the ghost is very like the king. He's as like the king as you are like yourself, i.e., he is the king. So that's the primary driver in that statement, in that line, the primary rhetorical force of that line. But of course, it in fact sets up the entire play at this moment, at the kind of crux moment in the history of how we've understood the human more generally. In that attempt to claim likeness with ourselves has also the opposite rhetorical effect, to make us realize we are never simply ourselves. We are only ever like ourselves. And the spectacle of a spectre haunting Denmark, the time out of joint, is a sign of the work that we need to do, the mimetic work we need to do to make us feel at one with our prostheses. So mimesis is that process by which we seek to claim ownership and likeness over our disparate extensions. Does that answer?
Yes, and I think Hamlet's example fits very well, and especially, but again, I mean, not to go into my second question, I would just try to understand what you're trying to say here. If you are trying to talk about likeness and how we reach ourselves through a kind of mimesis, why the reference to the spectre? Because the spectre itself is formless. Are you trying to suggest that the spectre from the formlessness is trying to arrive at a form?
I think Hamlet is driven, and obviously in the back of my mind as I'm talking here, is how we understand the rise of the novel, or the development of the novel as a form, in response to whatever out of jointness Hamlet is responding to. But Hamlet is a response to the perception that the spectrality of consciousness is dislodged from the materiality of being. And that dislodgement can be political, it can be caused by revolution or political atrocity or trauma. It's also a kind of ontological condition, but it may be that the central question of Hamlet, the play, is what political forces one needs to draw on to try and overcome that dislodgement. So the play begins with everything out of joint because the spectrality of conscious being and the materiality of embodied being have become remote from one another. And the play seeks to kind of resolve that problem, but it can only resolve it, in fact, through the figure of the play within the play, which is the key plot point in the play, through recognizing that mimesis is the necessary solution to political alienation, whilst it's also the mark of it. So mimesis tries to overcome the prosthetic distance between mind and matter, whilst also continually inducting us into its truth.
Right. So when you talk of the prosthetic surgeon as an artist, and that's in the beginning of your book, crafting faces that their patients desire. Do you think there is a kind of transgression you indulge in? Does the doctor really have that freedom of the artist? Aren't they more of an advanced photocopier, as they can never get out of the human, the lacking body? I mean, how do you compare the doctor to an artist is perhaps my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lovely phrase you've hit on there. The surgeon is the advanced photocopier. And partly what's at work in that phrase or that concept is that the surgeon isn't actually an artist. They're simply a mechanical machine, a mechanical agent reproducing something that's missing. And of course that's true. But it's also equally true, I think, that every copy is an interpretation, and that every copy has something like the status of an artwork. And while we talk about this, I might try and I'm going to try and share my screen here and show you this. Can people see that?
Yes, I think it's visible, yes.
Everyone knows this painting? Painting by Andy Warhol. Of course, Andy Warhol knows and tells us that each copy is an original in its own right. So here we've got images of the atomic bomb, of course. Each frame there, each square in that grid, contains within it a singular thing. Here, the end of the world, and the painting is interested in the way that singular event, the end of the world, is duplicated through here photocopying. And all of Warhol's work obviously is fascinated by the copy. Millions of copies of Marilyn Monroe, or the mechanical reproduction of Campbell's soup tins. But I think at the very heart of Warhol's aesthetic is the recognition that every creative act is at least two things. It's the attempt to capture something that's pre-existing. So in a sense, a mimetic act. To imitate something that's pre-existing, and a new thing in its own right. So not an imitation, but the thing itself. And the surgeons, I opened a book with a discussion where I did go and see a prosthetic surgeon who said that every time he starts work reconstructing someone's face, I mean, this is a ethically troubling kind of question, but every time he goes to work fixing somebody's face, he has to address this question. Does he want to make the face, does the patient want the surgeon to make the face like it used to be? So are you recreating a missing thing? And as an artist, making as good a likeness or a portrait of that face as you can? Or do you want to make the face anew in a way that's going to make it most comfortable or most effective or most functional for the patient, given whatever injury they've suffered? And I think we can see that kind of tension between standing in for a missing thing and creating a new thing in all works of art. And I think I do want to, if you'll allow me, I do want to give us an example, a recent example from, I don't know whether people have had a chance to read this, the new novel by Kazuo Ishiguro, Clara and the Sun. But to come to that example, what we can see here with the atomic bomb is that Warhol is interested here in a very particular technology of copying, which is the photocopier. And you can see that if you read the painting from the top left to the bottom right, each copy degrades. So that for the top left-hand corner, it's quite clear. The bottom left-hand corner, it's entirely faded away. So the end of the world as a nuclear apocalypse is shadowed by the end of things as a result of the exhaustion of copying. And that sort of sense of the relationship between the copy and the original is shaped here by our understanding of photocopying, a kind of mid to late 20th century technology, in which each copy degrades. But of course, we're now living under a technology in which copies don't degrade. The copy is the same as the original. And this is a long answer to your question, I know, so I'll speed up soon, but it's that kind of question, I think, that's at the heart of Ishiguro's new novel, Clara and the Sun. And Clara and the Sun is about a world in which children have artificial friends. They're called artificial friends. I don't know how many of us have read this novel. Have you seen it yet, Asijit?
No, I've seen the novel. I possess it, but I haven't read it.
And there's a plot point which I won't ruin it. I won't ruin the novel for those of us who haven't read it yet. But there's a plot point where Josie, who's the child who owns an artificial friend, Clara, who's a kind of robot. Josie is dying. I'm going to make sure I don't give away too much. And she goes, even though she's ill, she goes every now and then to a local guy called Mr. Capaldi, who's a very mysterious kind of character. And she's going to have her portrait taken. And Clara and the Sun is primarily, I think, others may disagree, I think it's about portraiture and what portraits do. And so Josie, the dying child with the artificial friend Clara, is going to have her portrait taken by this guy Capaldi. She's sitting for a portrait, but at a plot point, which it doesn't ruin the novel for me to tell you this. A plot point, Clara the robot and the artificial friend and Josie go along to Mr. Capaldi for a sitting, and Clara goes in to look at the portrait, even though she shouldn't do. It's hidden like Dorian Gray. And she realizes, shockingly, that this isn't a portrait at all. It's another artificial friend. And Capaldi isn't an artist making a portrait, is a scientist stroke surgeon creating a prosthetic replacement, which is absolutely at the heart of that question you asked me. Is a surgeon a copier or a maker? And how does that help us to understand this relationship between mimesis and prosthesis? And there's a line, for me, it's kind of stuck out like on one of those things that come out of a box and punch you in the face. Jack in the Box, perhaps that's what I'm thinking of. This line that the Capaldi, Mr. Capaldi, then has to kind of confess to being more like a scientist than an artist. And he says this, what you have to understand, Capaldi says to Josie and her parents and Clara, what you have to understand is this: the new Josie won't be an imitation. She really will be Josie, a continuation of Josie. So we can make a prosthetic replacement for Josie that won't be different. The copy won't be different from the original. It will just be another, it'll be, well, that word continuation. And I think Clara and the Sun is about thinking, is trying to think about this question, following on from Warhol, testing the reproductive capacities of photocopying. Clara and the Sun is about testing the reproductive capacities of genetic technology as it meets artificial intelligence, as it meets contemporary prosthetics. How far can we create a replica that is the same as the original? And do we think of this as an artistic enterprise, or as a mechanical enterprise, or as a scientific enterprise? And where does consciousness, where does the kind of miracle or the surplus or the supplement of consciousness sit in that shifting relationship between the original and the copy?
Right. So again, my question is from the point of, let's say, from the point of speculative fiction and technocentrism. So what is your opinion of the transhumanist claims of, let's say, cryonic reanimation or uploading human consciousness into a machinic brain? Because they're all prosthetic in nature and kind. I mean, which side are you on? I mean, are you up for choosing a side? Is perhaps my question.
I think that trying to understand the relationship between speculative fiction and whatever period we're now in terms of the possibilities of cryogenic suspension, the possibilities of immortality. I think we'll come on to this later on. Possibilities of telepathy. It seems to me that increasingly the imaginary that's driven speculative fiction and science fiction is now reality. I mean, that's not a new or a surprising thing to say. We've dreamt of being telepathic, and now we are. We've dreamt of being immortal. We clearly are at a kind of moment where the way that lifespan or a natural lifespan presses upon our conception of our lives is changing, because technologies are enabling us to extend ourselves possibly indefinitely. I'm sure many of us will have seen recently, we've had the first example of a prosthetic lens being implanted directly into the brain, which obviously is a wonderful thing. It enables people who have been blind from birth to see, but it clearly enables us to see at a distance. That kind of prosthetic seeing isn't going to be just to correct blindness. It's going to be a way of, I want to talk to my daughter when she's away in university. I can see her, I can see with her, because we can see through prosthetic devices. All of those speculative fictional ideas are becoming realized. And so then the question is, how does the contemporary novel help us to imagine what consciousness is going to be like under those conditions? And so you started off by thinking about cryonic reanimation. We've got obviously lots of examples of novels which deal with this quite directly. A recent example would be Don DeLillo's 0K, which is directly about imagining a facility where you go and suspend yourself in order to live forever. But I can see a kind of ghostly fascination with cryogenics right across the contemporary novel, not just novels about immortality, but so something like J.M. Coetzea's Jesus novels, the cycle of novels set around this strange kind of purgatorial post-death landscape. You can see that that's part of the same interest in the contemporary novel that we see in DeLillo's 0K, in what a kind of cryogenically extended life looks like. And you can see that these authors are using or utilizing or thinking through the novel form as a way of thinking how consciousness relates to bodies when bodies are free from some of the material limits that have defined us up to now.
Right. So when we speak of, let's say, biomedical editing, right, from genetic codes and memories to a 3D prosthesis, actually. So aren't we consciously dealing with class privilege and biopolitics? I mean, what about the democratization of information or its availability to the underprivileged, which is especially a question for, let's say, third world countries. And stretching it a little further, is the new technological novel a novel for everyone, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. And there are kind of two initial ways into that. The first might be to return somewhat to what I said in relation to your last question, which is about the sort of dire consequences, the dire economic consequences of near immortality. And we might, if those of us, probably not many of us are old enough to remember this, but I was in my 20s when the internet came about. When I tell my children that the internet didn't exist when I wrote my PhD, I mean, they can't they can't believe it, and nor can I. In fact, I have to kind of check myself, but it is true. It didn't exist when I wrote my PhD. And I remember as it was kind of becoming a reality through the 90s, the sense was it was going to be a deeply democratizing thing. And the combination of artificial intelligence, new technologies are producing problems which don't feel very democratizing, clearly. I mean, which feel troubling and dystopian, frankly. And you can see that if there's going to be access to very extended life, then it's going to be access that's restricted to the wealthy, and it will produce a distinction between the immortal wealthy and the mortal poor, which is, and it's difficult to see how that ends well. And the second kind of response to this, I think, is they're everywhere that we see thinking about artificial intelligence. That does artificial intelligence allow us to free ourselves from the limits of the human? And does it allow us to think in new and different ways? Or is artificial intelligence really just us programming our own limitations, our own prejudices into machines and thus duplicating them? So artificial intelligence is AIs learn things like misogyny, learn things like racism very quickly, and then simply replicate them. So I think that both those questions, how we deal with the economics of immortality and how we imagine artificial intelligence as a simple extension of our own prejudices and weaknesses and shortcomings and blindnesses. This really turns around, I think, whether we want to think like a utopian or whether we want to think like a dystopian. And one way that we can materialize this is to think about the difference between Wikipedia and Facebook, which may seem like a banal way to think about it, but and many people will probably have a problem with Wikipedia. But Wikipedia seems to me to have taken the democratizing idea of the internet and just gone with it. I mean, I find it a moving and amazing thing that you can have a source of knowledge accessible to everyone who's got access to a computer and Wi-Fi. That is written not by a single person, but written by everyone. And it's really overcome the problems of Encyclopedia Britannica, which is just imprinting colonial knowledge, or maybe every encyclopedia before this one, which is producing knowledge in a basically a colonial way. Wikipedia has overcome that, or has got the seeds of overcoming it, and it's also not narrowing and closing, but widening, and will continually edit itself until it naturally becomes a democratic record of how to think about the world, or maybe possibly. Whereas Facebook and Twitter seem to go in the other direction and produce extremely closed, narrow echo boxes that don't open up but close down. And I think you can look in both directions here. And my habit of mind is to try to think like a utopian and not like a dystopian, if there is such a thing, and try and think how new technologies might make new forms of democracy possible, as Wikipedia has, rather than trying to defend an existing concept of democracy or an interesting existing concept of the human against things which might adulterate it. That second mode or habit of mind, I think, is regressive and doesn't get us anywhere. And we need, however frightening these things are, we need to find ways of thinking about how they might produce new and better democracies.
Right. So I personally, I find two very different kinds of meaning in your elaboration of prosthesis. One is, of course, the artificial technological extension from a mechanical arm or a prosthetic leg to the camera or the telephone. The other, of course, is the body itself as a fragment, which evolves by appropriating nature and turning it into prosthetic tools. Do you think that the realization of the loss of the originary moment when the body was singular, of the body as always the receiver of prosthetic supplements, is the primary cause of alienation from one's body? The fear that it has its own distinct borrowed mechanism and can malfunction anytime?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer maybe is to think about this, the two different concepts that you describe through a dialogue one can hear between Freud and Derrida. Freud has a very distinct concept of prostheses. He says in Civilization and Its Discontents that we can imagine a moment where we're born and we're a mere unextended person, what he calls a mere inch of nature, where we're pre-prosthetic, and then we have our prosthetic tools attached to us, which he says make us like prosthetic gods. But for him, it's possible to imagine that we have a body that isn't prosthetically enhanced, and that would then give us the first conception that you were describing, that you can identify prostheses as things that aren't natural and given to the body, but that are added onto it, often in place of missing body parts, but maybe just extensions or enhancements. That's what Freud thinks that the telescope is, and the telephone is, and the steam train is. These are prosthetic enhancements of the way that we see, the way that we hear, the way that we run. And clearly that's a very powerful way of thinking about prosthetics as additions and enhancements to the way that our body interacts with the world. Derrida, though, would have a very different concept, or does have a very different concept, and he, one of his major forms of interacting with Freud is through this difference that for Derrida there is no pre-prosthetic body, that when we meet with the body, it is already prosthetic. That's how we come to language, how we come to knowledge of ourselves, is through a prosthetic relationship to ourselves. The way that he puts it is that there is a prosthesis at the origin. And if you're at the end of your question, that sense that our alienation from our body comes about through our recognition of its prosthetic nature. I'm sure that's true, and it may be that Derrida's different conception of the prosthesis from Freud's is more or less the natural one for us now, because technology has made us so conscious. Technology has made us so conscious of the way that we are prosthetized. You know, I was speaking to my sister-in-law the other day, who says that she actually can't manage without her phone in her hand. It's a kind of constant thing for her that she's not here unless she's got her phone in her hand. She was a bit worried about this, but you know, I think it's a very available concept to us, that we have become synonymous with our prostheses, and so that then makes us feel subject to their malfunctioning in precisely the way that you describe.
Right. So this is the most fundamental question, I think, concerning the book. And it's a very straightforward question: is how do novels reflect the mechanism of the prosthetic or the artificial, which is also, again, the foundational question of the book, I think.
You're right. It's the central question. It's a straightforward question. It's a difficult question to ask, to answer. So I know I've been talking for a bit too long already. So but if you let me try and give you some examples. I think the way that I read the novel is that its formal attribute, its formal singularity, is that it sits or gives us access to the ground or the connective tissue between mind and material, between the unextended being and extended being. And we may be much more familiar with the idea that the real characteristic of the novel is that it gives us a sense of interiority, that over its history it gets very good at allowing us to see what people are thinking. And that's obviously true, but I think the way that I'm trying to read the history of the novel here is not so much as as a form that gives us access to interiority, as a form that allows us access to that switch or that connection between reality and representations of reality, or material out there in the world and material as we think and make pictures of it. And two examples to try and give you a sense of why I think the novel is so good at getting access to that connective space. The first would be the novel that I can't remember who said this. It was such a lovely thing to say that maybe it was Borges, I think, so who says that that every novel in the history of the novel has Cervantes' Don Quixote running through it like a kind of filigree. And I think one can see this ability of the novel to sit in this ground between reality and representations of reality. You can see that capacity so clearly in Don Quixote that you ask yourself, is Don Quixote a small landowner called Quixano, or is he the light and mirror of knight errantry, the person who goes around saving Dulcinea from distress? And the answer is obvious, isn't it? The answer is obviously that he's both, that he's not one and he's not the other. Is Mambrino's helmet, if we've got Don Quixote in our minds, is Mambrino's helmet a barber's basin, or is it a piece of mythical armor that grants you invincibility? Again, it's both. And what the novel does is it shows you how it can follow the switch from one mode of reality, one mode of representing and thinking about reality, to another, so that Don Quixote can be both quotidian and an imagined superhero, and they can be those two things at once. And the novel sits at that boundary between what reality is and how we make pictures of that reality, and how they conjoin to make a life world. And Quixote is in every novel because Don Quixote sets the terms in which the novel can do that. And then that of course then evolves over the history of the novel. And what my book does is to trace that evolution and to try and write history of that evolution as it comes about in relation to shifting technologies on the one hand and the history of aesthetics on the other. And the other example would be not from the early 17th century, but from the early 19th century. And to see how that has changed the novel's access to this prosthetic join that I'm interested in, how it's changed in the passage from Cervantes to Jane Austen. I don't know how many of us have got Jane Austen's perfect novel Emma close to the front of our minds, but there's a plot point in Emma. Emma's a matchmaker. She likes to create marriages between people, partly because she feels herself to be abandoned by her governess marrying. So she's continually matchmaking in order to make up for that sort of loss. And the novel starts by her making a match between the local vicar, Mr. Elton, and her artificial friend, not an Ishiguro artificial friend, but a friend who she kind of makes up called Harriet. And the clear claim of the novel, of Austen's novel Emma, is that Emma isn't really a friend of Harriet's. In fact, she doesn't even know her. She's just made her up in order to fill in the gap left by her governess, who's married. And the way that the novel thinks about that, about the relationship between artificial friends and what might be real friends, is through, like Ishiguro, actually, it's occurring to me as I'm speaking, that is through the question of portraiture. So Emma, in order to make Mr. Elton fall in love with her friend Harriet, it's hilarious. I mean, it's a very, very hilarious novel. Emma paints a portrait of Harriet, making her look very beautiful, so that Mr. Elton might fall in love with her. And of course, Mr. Elton doesn't fall in love with Harriet, he falls in love with Emma, not the artwork, but the sculptor, the portraitist. And what Austen's novel is doing with creating this picture of a portrait, an avowedly artificial or an avowedly inaccurate picture of an already artificial friend, is that it looks at these forms of mistaken representation in order to imagine or to develop a crucible in which we can form pictures of real attachments, real relationships, real friendships. And it asks how one would go about doing that. So you can see that Emma is kind of servantine. Emma is like Quixote, in that she tries to bend everything to her mistaken perception. But the novel tries to produce a way of imagining how we join representations to real things. But the beauty of it is that it recognizes that it's only through the mimetic play of style, of irony, that's particular place that the novel can imagine or produce between how we think inside ourselves and how the world out there relates to those forms of thinking. It's only by sitting in that space, which itself won't come to view, that the novel creates that form of seeing. And it's also because it only lives in that strange narrative gap and junction between ways of seeing and what is seen, that it's very difficult to translate the novel into other forms, even though we do it all the time. All of us know that if you make a film of Emma, like Clueless, or if you make a play of Emma, you'll capture something of it, but what you won't get is that formal capacity to sit in the space between an immaterial consciousness and the ways that that consciousness materializes itself. That is only possible, I'd say, in the novel form. That's what it is. That's what it does. And to understand the history of the novel is to understand how that hidden formal junction operates, and how it operates in tandem or in relation to the historical evolution of technological and political environments.
Right. So my next question focuses on the link that you established between the growth of the novel, let's say through Thomas More and Cervantes and or Bacon, and the anatomical practices prevalent in the 16th and 17th centuries. So would it be correct to say that the bodies of the animals of Galen or of the criminals of Vesalius, on which the anatomies were performed, acted as the real prosthetic ground for the cohesion and cohesion of modern science and the proto-modern novel?
Mm. Yeah, again, the short answer is yes. I'm not going to give you as long an answer as the second response, but what I will do is I'll show a picture if I can. I'm going to have to do that. Can you see that?
Yes, it's visible, yes.
So the question is, does the anatomy of Vesalius produce the kind of prosthetic ground upon which our view of our life worlds, our relationship?
So yeah, the question is perhaps, are we looking at a criminal, or are we looking at a prosthetic, very hard concrete prosthetic ground upon which art and history and a novel is constructed?
Yeah,
animal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, very fascinating painting, this, and I think the sort of the conventional or accepted reading of it is that it is, can you see my cursor when I do that?
Yes, I can see. Yeah.
There's the body of the criminal. He was hung for stealing a coat, which is ironic given that he's obviously not wearing one here. So here's the body of the criminal. Here are non-criminal people. These are the scientists of the guild and the great and the good. And the conventional reading is that we can see here the ways in which power and enlightenment, rationality, take the kind of lifeless body of the corpse and impose a kind of epistemology upon it. So the autopsy, the process by which we look inside the body here, is also the process by which the poor body, the criminal, the disobedient, dissident body, is then brought under the power and authority of the state, as embodied here by scientists and artists. And I think that's obviously what's going on. What makes this painting so fascinating to me is that whilst it seems to bring things to light, it also gets a kind of access, or a limited kind of access, to precisely that place that I've just been describing, that hidden junction between mind and prosthetic extension, and makes you realize it can't, oh look, we didn't want that to happen. I don't know how to make that not happen. But so I maybe just have to talk about it without us seeing. But it brings this kind of strange junction to light in its resistance to visibility. I wish I could stop that from being like that.
I think you can stop this sharing and reshare it again.
Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. No, it seems to still be like that.
Can you refresh the page? I think there's a refresh.
Yeah, I'll try that. I'll stop sharing. Bear with me. Sorry, technology is not my strong suit, not my métier. I'll refresh the screen. Oh, just going again. Here we go. I hope this is going to be worth it. when I okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Now, if everyone can see what's going, there's a kind of drama to this painting. There's a performance that's going on. You can see, in fact, that Tulp here, the scientist, he is kind of like an artist, isn't he? So this is in some sense a self-portrait, in that you can see this is like Rembrandt standing with a brush and a palette in his hand. He's standing in a painterly pose. But what Tulp is doing is his with his left hand is showing you what would happen to the corpse's hand if these muscles were contracted. Yes. So he's pulling them with his scalpel or his scissors or whatever they are. And with the other hand saying, this is what would happen. My hands would be doing this if my own tendons were moved in the way that I'm moving them with my scissors. Which is intensely dramatically interesting, I think, or it seems to me to be intensely interesting. And what it tells you is that, yes, I share something with this body, because what's going on inside my arm here is the same as what's going on inside that arm there. And in opening that one up, in opening this arm up, we see something about what's inside this, which is fair enough. And not only do we see that connection, we see how it's stored. We see that inside this guy's brain here, he's got a really good understanding of surgical mechanics. This guy here has got a copy of Vesalius's fabric. So he's got some anatomical knowledge that he's gleaned from this book. This guy here isn't looking at the arm of the corpse, he's looking at the picture of the arm of the corpse on this copy of Vesalius's fabric here. So we've got anatomical knowledge in Vesalius here, anatomical knowledge in a copy of Vesalius here, anatomical knowledge in this guy's head, and anatomical reality here inside this arm, which is mirrored in the shared movement between this hand, and obviously the hand of the painter, who we can't see, who's standing where we are, painting the thing. And so you've got all of these different forms of knowledge storage. And the painting is saying, well, perhaps they can all come together. Perhaps there's a way of using art and science to bring the hidden workings of the mind into the light. But as much as the painting suggests that, it makes you realize that it isn't anywhere, that the thinking that connects these I'm not going to do it again, those eyes to that hand, to that body, it doesn't reside in that painting. It resides in some unfathomable place, which is, I think that unfathomable place is the place of the novel as a form. It's what the novel grows up to give shape to. And in so doing, allows us both to see the unthinkability of the movement of mind, but also get as close as we can through any of our forms to how it feels, how it works.
Right, but I, again, not going into my next question, I just want to, there's a kind of observation which is very ironic in this painting, is that neither the nobleman nor the scientists are really looking at the body. which is also a rejection of the criminal, that I'm here, but I'm not here to look at you.
Yeah.
So what do you think about it? I mean, it's a prosthetic device, the body, and yet there's a rejection that, no, you are, after all.
Yeah, I wish we hadn't lost it, because now I'm not going to be able to go back to it. But yeah, the whole painting is held together by its various looks, and they're all. I mean, there's a sort of intensity of looking where the junior surgeons are looking at the kind of head honcho with a certain kind of erotic longing, and this poor dead guy is nowhere. But the drama of the painting is the way that this kind of complex of gazes suggests an attempt at higher thought that is supposedly, and we'll come back to this in another way, I think, later in this discussion, that is supposedly bringing this body into its dynamics. But of course, we can all see that what's left out is that body. I mean, it's unassimilable in some sense to this poetry of gazes. Right. So, and would you agree that the colonizer's desire, akin to that of a surgeon, to cut open and stitch back the body, stitch the land of the colonized in a way, and made the natives into another kind of prosthetic that was inducted into the execution of nation building? Yeah. Again, the short answer is yes, and that the novel from its early days has been fascinated with the ways in which the body resists ownership under certain conditions. Here in Rembrandt is interested in the way that the criminal body isn't assimilable, but one early novel that is perhaps the perfect reference in response to your question would be Aphra Behn's Orinoco, which is a novel about an African prince, Orinoco, who's sold into slavery. And it's interesting to me anyway, it was a copy was owned by Jonathan Locke, who is writing at the time that Ben was writing, was producing his conception of ownership, the bedrock of democracy being that we all have a property in our own person. So that's Jonathan Locke's central claim. We all have a property in our own person. Of course, you don't have a property in your own person if you're a slave who's owned by a slave trader. And the sense in which we have a property in our own person is obviously changed if we're a criminal and we've been locked up or executed, or if we're living under any kind of colonial regime. The colonial regime exerts its own claim of ownership over your body in a very profound way. And it's interesting to me that the original moment or originary moment in the history of the novel is around that experience, what it is to not own yourself, as Orinoco doesn't. And anyone who's read that novel will remember the just extraordinary scenes at the close of the novel where Orinoco, his response to being owned, being owned as a slave, is to stand in front of his owners and disembowel himself and cut pieces of himself off, cut bits of his throat out and throw them at his owners. And Ben's narrative is trying to work out how this binding that I've been describing between mind and body takes place through the intermediary of colonialism or of slavery. And that's something obviously you can see running through the history of the novel, from Aphra Behn to Toni Morrison, where Morrison is interested in the gap between the body that we own ourselves and the body that's owned by our masters. And the novel is a privileged form in trying to work in the difference between those two forms of embodiment. A wonderful, wonderful line in The Bluest Eye is where Morrison looks at the hand that with which we wash ourselves and the hand with which we perform tasks for our masters. And she said the only difference, all the difference between those two hands is the difference itself. The difference is all the difference that there is. And the novel is a machine for testing that difference, I think.
Right. So you refer extensively to Gulliver's Travels in your book. So regarding the 18th century novels, there is something particularly disconcerting about Gulliver's misanthropy. So if we categorize the first two books as matter and the other two as obsessing over mind, do you think Gulliver's disorientation results from this choice between these prosthetic bodies and consciousnesses? Because that's how the book is divided. The little books are the prosthetic bodies, and the human limbs are consciousnesses, also prosthetic bodies. So, and therefore the difficulty in Gulliver's choice.
Yeah, I think that's a really clear and lovely way of thinking about the novel. That when we're in Brobdingnag and Lilliput, we're in the world of prosthetized bodies. Obviously, in the first one, all the bodies are very big. In the second one, they're all very small, and in the second one, they're all very big. But that alerts us to this kind of prosthetic alienation that we've been describing as we view our own bodies and others. Of course, Gulliver in books 1 and 2 becomes profoundly alienated from his own body, because when he's in Lilliput, he thinks he's giant. And when he's in Brobdingnag, he thinks he's tiny. So it's not just what you're looking at, but the organs of looking themselves that become alienated through that prosthetic encounter. And in books 3 and 4, when we're in the academy and we're in Hwynimland, they're absolutely about consciousness and intellect. And I mean, the horses in Hwynimland are these beautiful Apollonian beings whose extension and mind are one. There's no gap between them, even though, I mean, it's obviously a joke, they're horses. And they're forever doing things that horses couldn't do. So drawing our attention to the fact that they're fantastic. But the misanthropy in your question, the misanthropy in Gulliver's Travels, I think, reaches its pitch in book 4 in precisely the terms you suggest, in that it imagines a consciousness, and here Gulliver's consciousness, that can't find a body in which to lodge itself. So I mean, the very memorable ending of the novel is that he feels himself and his family to be yahoos, these awful, miserable creatures that are the representations of humans in the novel. And we're left with this sense that, in fact, I can't look in the mirror, because if I look in the mirror, I think of myself, I don't see any match between my Apollonian horse mind and this terrible creature that is human being. But what I think, my sense of the novel anyway, is that whilst that's deeply misanthropic, it's also the utopian charge of this novel. That through the prosthetic bodies of 1 and 2 and the displaced minds of 3 and 4, we see that whatever we know about the world, we know that there's a gap. There's a gap between how we think and how our thoughts get made manifest. And that gap is a utopian one. It's because there's a gap between how we think and how we are materialized, that we're able to imagine things at all, that we're able to think about the world at all, and that we're able to make the world in any sense better than it is now. So I insist on reading it as the utopian book, even though it's obviously anti-utopian satire. It's still got an amazing utopian charge.
Right. So there is this fascinating portion in your book where you talk about hands. So on the one hand, you talk about the hand as a mechanical industrial extension of Victorian body. And on the other, there's a spectral prosthetic hand that resists the call of the technological mind. So how does one understand this image of this dead hand, which you refer to, in Victorian novels like Dracula or Frankenstein? So how to negotiate, as if, between the automated hand of Chaplin in modern times, as if, and the hand that writes the novel?
Yeah. I mean, I started writing that it's a very long chapter, ridiculously long chapter in the middle of the book, and I had no conception as I wrote it that I'd start to become convinced, as perhaps one does, that the dead hand is in fact everywhere. That you can't think of the novel. You certainly can't think of the 19th century novel without thinking about it as a dead hand in some way. Both the kind of so-called realist tradition of the 19th century and the Gothic tradition, they're absolutely shaped by this doubleness of the hand. As you say, the hand is the kind of mark of industrial mechanized life. I mean, hands is a word that you give, of course, to industrial laborers. Hands. The hand is the mark of us stamping the world with our own manufactured image. The hand is out there in the world, but also the hand is the most intimate relationship to mind that we can get. I mean, as a body part, there isn't a more intimate one, is there, than the hand? I mean, obviously we're all thinking of other possible body parts that feel quite intimate, but the sense of touch. I mean, the word is haptic, isn't it? The hand enables touch. If we close our eyes and imagine touching something, what do we touch it with? We touch it with our fingers, don't we? And rather than our noses or our elbows. And so the hand registers the most naked kind of mind going out into the world and feeling it. And I think that sort of distinction between the hand as the organ of touch and the hand as the mark of industrialized, mechanized being, that's everywhere in the 19th century novel. It's in Dracula and Frankenstein, and it's in Bleak House and Emma, and it's absolutely everywhere. And what the novel, I think, is trying to do, if we can give agency to the novel, if there's a kind of purpose driving that form, it's how to both understand the hand in its doubleness and to find a form in which we might bring the spectral hand, as you call it, the spectral hand that opens Melville's Moby Dick, as it happens. If you remember, Ishmael is told off by his mum and sent up into his bedroom at the beginning of Moby Dick. And he imagined, he has to be in his bedroom for like 2 days. I can't remember how long, but it's a long time. And all the way through, he feels a spectral hand in his, kind of comforting him. And he says, I feel that hand in mine from that moment in childhood to the day I die. It's always with me. And I think Moby Dick is about trying to marry that spectral hand to the, Ahab's incredibly manifest body and hand, prosthetized body and hand. And the novel as a whole is trying to find out how you bring those models of handedness together.
Right. So in the modern novel, coming to the modern novel actually, so we are always aware of the concrete distinction and separateness between, let's say, the unextended mind and its extensions, between the mechanized being and inward self. So do you think there is a tendency in modern novels of prosthetic insistence, that it is instead the prosthetic that survives and not the real body, a kind of unassimilated other which exists outside of everyone else? Let's say a case in point is perhaps The Lighthouse, to The Lighthouse, where the lighthouse as the prosthetic Mrs. Ramsay remains even after the death of Mrs. Ramsay.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely way of thinking about it. And if we take what we've been describing so far as realism and 19th century realism as a way of trying to assimilate unassimilable things, trying to bring together, say, the spectral hand and the material hand. It's very difficult, in my view, to historicize the move from 19th century realism to modernism without mischaracterizing both. It's very difficult to do that. But it may be that one way to try to do that is to think that shift when you're saying that, when you're finding in Woolf an interest in the unassimilability of material signs, here, the lighthouse. It may be that something that's happening to the modern novel around in the early 20th century, and happens a little bit before at the late 19th as well, I think, is that the novel shifts from being interested in assimilating the prosthetic to being interested in the forms and terms in which prosthetic material resists assimilation. So it goes from trying to naturalize the prosthetic to being interested in how the prosthetic or how nature itself is prosthetized. And Woolf would be one example, but there may be others. Gertrude Stein, for example, is very interested in the ways in which the hard surfaces of life resist our attempt to knock the edges off their prosthetic existence, and that might be a very fruitful way and a less reductive way of seeing something that happens to realism. Woolf's famous line on or around June, 1910, everything changes, human nature changes. Of course, though, history doesn't work like that, but it may be that realism shades into modernism through something like a recognition of the unassimilability of prosthetic. Right. It's an interesting way of looking at it. So especially in Beckett, if we look, which is also my favorite area. So especially in Beckett, we discovered a prosthetic externalized internal voice and a continuous effort to narrativize and conjoin it with its decaying, isolated self and body. And yet there are rejections of other prosthetic fictions and selves, a process of filtering to reach the original self or silence, any way we see it. So how does Beckett, according to you, balance between these two contradictory acts? So therefore, is fiction as a prosthetic the only thing that perseveres and persists, whereas the artist is always the one who fails? Again, I think that's a really powerful way of putting it. That fiction is the prosthetic that persists, yeah, I would agree that's the outcome of Beckett's thinking. And a way that we might see that would be to think about the middle novel of the mid-period, mid-career trilogy, Malone Dies. Which is really about the attempt that you're describing. I mean, Malone Dies is about a man lying in bed, dying, and writing his own death. And as he writes his own death, as Proust, of course, tried to do, as he writes his own death, he writes other stories, 3 other stories. So it's a trilogy, in fact. So he's putting himself very much in Beckett's place. Who is also writing a trilogy of novels. And what the novel is testing really is how fiction itself might incorporate itself into itself. Malone Dies might take the process of writing, absorb it into the story of Malone's death, and thus kill it, kind of wipe itself out. But there are prosthetics everywhere in this novel. Malone has a kind of crutch that he uses to get his objects, control his objects in the room. His body itself feels like a prosthetic. He says at one point, if I had the use of my body, I'd throw it out the window. But the real prosthetic, I think that the standout prosthetic in Malone Dies is the pencil with which he's writing the novel. And there's a kind of moment of knockabout comedy where he drops his pencil underneath the bed and he has to spend ages with his stick trying to get it back. And you think, well, who's writing this bit? because you haven't got. Are you writing this from memory? But what won't go away is the pencil, and in fact, the last lines of the novel leave us with his pencil and his stick, his crutch as one prosthetic, and the pencil with which he writes the novel as the other. And that, in a sense, is sort of where Beckett leaves us. That however much you want to disappear, and however much you can't avoid disappearing, you leave a kind of prosthetic residue, which is the apparatus of writing and reading itself.
Right. So could you talk a little bit about the prosthetic selves and the desire to return to what Proust calls abyss of not being, especially with reference to Joyce, Proust, and maybe Beckett also?
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to think that Beckett sort of radicalizes the negativity of Proust's and Joyce's modernism. So he seems more extreme than them. I mean, Beckett, writing on Proust, says that Proust shrinks from the nullity of extra circumferential phenomena, that Proust is about freeing oneself from matter and entering simply into the world of the artwork. And you can see that both Proust and Joyce are, in a sense, doing that. The circularity of Finnegan's Wake, that Finnegan's Wake is a circle. It doesn't start anywhere or end anywhere, and it tries to circle around itself to absorb everything in the world into the artwork, and thus somehow aestheticize life, so there's nothing extraneous. Proust does something similar. You get to the end of Proust and you realize you have to reread it, and what à la Recherche is doing is taking a messy world out there and absorbing it into the world of the artwork in order to neutralize it, to shrink from it, in Beckett's terms. And it's easy to think that Beckett inherits Joyce's and Proust's determination to kill off the world by turning it into an artwork, and radicalizes it in that he is clearly the writer. I mean, it's difficult to avoid the feeling that he's the writer who tests disappearance harder than anyone else. But I think really what happens in his relationship to Proust and Joyce, and this is a much too involved argument for me to prove or evidence really here, but is that rather than radicalizing disappearance, I think what he ends up with, as with the pencil in Malone Dies, is that he hits a kind of limit to how far the artwork is able to incorporate the prosthetic. and leaves us with a materiality, or what Beckett himself calls a residue. He writes a series of short fictions called Residua, and they really are about reducing things, but reducing things to a residue that then won't go away. Whereas Joyce and Proust felt that the world could go away if it was sufficiently aestheticized. Whereas Beckett realizes that the aesthetic and the prosthetic, one is never going to overcome the other.
Right. So there is a very interesting part towards the end of your book where you both equate and differentiate simulacrum and prosthesis. So my question is prosthesis always the first point as biological origin or exteriorization, followed by the simulacrum in representations, or do they unfold simultaneously? So how do you differentiate between these two seemingly similar occurrences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult question and a massive question. The way that I imagine that dialogue between prosthesis and simulacra in the book is to imagine it in terms of a dialogue between Jacques Derrida and Stiegler, Bernard Stiegler. And the way that one might cast this is that Derrida sees, as I've said already, Derrida sees there's a prosthesis at the origin. So he feels that we can't ever encounter ourselves without encountering a supplement, a prosthetic supplement, which we then try and own but can't. Derrida's thought tends to equate that recognition with simulacra. For him, the prosthetic and the simulacra are almost the same. So, and in fact, there are many moments in his work where he explicitly says they're the same. The supplement that you see, the prosthetic supplement that you find in your initial relationship with your body, is identical for him to the supplement that you find when you realize that we need representations, that we can't think without language. So we're always finding ourselves translated, not being simply as we are, but translated into a language which is never at one with itself. And that gap between who we are and how we represent ourselves in language is equated for Derrida to that gap between who we are as a body and how we prosthetize ourselves. And in his work, that the supplement, the prosthetic supplement, tends to vanish into representation, tends to vanish into the idea of the simulacra, which is the copy without the original. So although this is a very complicated set of maneuvers, I think there is the kind of structured feeling of Derrida's work is that the materiality of the prosthetic vanishes into the simulacra, representational simulacra. Stiegler tends to try and see a gap between prosthetics and simulacra, in that he tries to find a way of articulating, without riding roughshod over Derrida's work, trying to articulate how a material prosthesis might remain material and not vanish into simulacra, that is, the copy without an original. And the way that Stiegler puts this is that I want to find out how cortex, mind matter, becomes manifest in flint, in stone, in the non-imagined. And in my book, I try to read that dialogue between Derrida and Stiegler, between prostheses which become identical with simulacra and prostheses which have a resistance to the simulacral. I try to read the 20th century novel as a kind of place where that dialogue is played out.
Right. So my last question is regarding your understanding of what constitutes a posthuman novel. So should it highlight the anthropocentric misreading of nature as prosthetic, or talk about climate history and man's extinction, collective becomings, and perhaps stress on a reversal of the Heideggerian notion that rocks and trees do not exist? So should that be the ideal posthuman novel, which is the reversal of the Heideggerian idea that rocks and trees do not exist?
Yeah, I think it should do. The posthuman novel should do all of those things. You quote Heidegger, the rocks and trees do not exist. That Heidegger's categories, the threefold category, stones are worldless, animals are poor in world, humans are world forming. That categorization can't stand, can it? I mean, there'll be many people who will take issue with that, with the crudity of that construction. But whatever we're doing now, we're trying to find a way of understanding that stones are not worldless, and we're trying to develop pictures of our world that can understand or respond to the fact that stones are rich in world, as are animals. That's maybe the challenge of our times, and the posthuman novel has to, and is in the process of trying to find images that recognize that being might be placed in a stone. But I suppose where I'd like to end our conversation is to insist maybe that the posthuman novel is perhaps not. I mean, it's perhaps a meaningless category, because I think that the main discovery, if that's the right word, or the main conviction of my book is that the novel has always been posthuman. And it's an extraordinarily rich resource for thinking how we produce pictures of the world where there is being in a stone. And it's always been trying to do that, even if it hasn't known it.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Boxall. The session is now open for questions. The first question is by Jerry Gordon. Jerry, since I can see you, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I will try.
Yes.
Let's see if I can find. It feels like a long time ago when I asked this question. But at the very beginning, you talked about this point that I thought was quite interesting. That that it's possible now that your daughter can have a kind of implant within her eye, and you can communicate almost telepathically. And when you said that, it brought up a question about if we have that ability technologically where we can see because of an implant within a person's brain, for example, would we then start to just see through each other's eyes? You know, if we're inside of, you know, if I am inside of my daughter's vision, would then that kind of, you know, would the divide between me and her vanish? And is there a reason to continue that divide? What would be lost when that divide would vanish? So anyway, just your that point, which I didn't know, we now have that capability to insert this vision chip into someone who can't see. But anyway, just it extended this idea. So you know, you can disregard it or say it's too long ago or whatever.
No, I mean, I think it's really interesting, and yeah, this technology does exist. That a prosthetic lenses which can bypass the biological retina, and also technology that allows us to control things on a computer simply with our minds. I mean, it sounds like I'm talking nonsense, but you know, this technology is here, and it's not going to be long before these kind of interfaces, they're so crude, aren't they? I mean, we've been operating computers through keyboards and mouses since the beginning of computing, and I can tell you it's not going to last for very much longer, that we're going to find more seamless interfaces with computing, and then obviously with each other. I mean, the internet makes us telepathic anyway, and it's only a sort of evolution of the interface before we are just in contact with one another. I think that sort of technological interface doesn't produce conscious interface. In what we're doing and what we will continue to need to do is find new models and forms with which to think how we translate one consciousness to another through new technologies.
Right.
So I don't think it's primarily or certainly not only a question of techne or of technology. It's a question of the formal languages through which we will adapt our interpersonal relations and our relations with ourselves as they become seamless or differently negotiated through technologies.
Yeah, it interests me because, I mean, as like listening to you talk, I start to churn with, you know, anytime I go on to Amazon or anytime I go on to, you know, my search engine or something, it's kind of already knows what I'm thinking. It already knows what I'm planning to get to. And then it provides that quite quickly, or it's already there waiting for me. Like, I bought this book and now this is the next book I should buy. So it's kind of already in my mind. And I can see that evidence when I get into the technology. With my devices, like you said, with your sister, you know, there's this intimacy that becomes almost like it's not even it's not a distance, it's a necessity. It needs to be a part of me. And so it feels like, yeah, the next extension is going to be, it will be inserted within me. And it will feel just like overcoming an inconvenience. Like, oh yeah, why didn't I do this 5 years ago? And then, like, with this idea that you will communicate with your daughter, not by calling her on the phone, but just by bringing her up in your mind, I then wondered, like, well, then we start to see through the algorithms that read us already, that you will have already, I will already know what my daughter has been looking at. I will have this data provided to me. And then the idea of self, the idea of other, the idea of privacy, the idea of intimacy and honesty, and all of these things feel like they start to boil somehow. So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
I couldn't agree more. And you know, is the question that we discussed earlier about artificial intelligence, does it simply embed algorithms, or does it allow us to invent new and potentially democratizing ways of thinking, new forms of consciousness? I mean, I share your. I mean, obviously, it's a horrifying idea that we're going to become part human, part computer, but it's gonna happen. I don't see any way that it's not.
I mean, it may not be part computer. It may be I will know my daughter in a way that my parents have never known me. And again, will that be an incredible feeling of intrusion, or will it be like every, you know, parent wants to know what everything is happening with their child?
Well, it's up to us, isn't it? It's up to us to find a way of inventing ways to make this technology democratically enabling. And
I wonder. I'm more of the cynical, where we will, in the sense that we will expect it to be there before we even know we need it. And then those rights that we have of autonomy and privacy will just be vanished. And we'll already be in that other world.
I absolutely share the fear here. And you know, as I say, I try to find a way of. I don't think dystopian thinking does us any good. We have to be critical utopians, in my view. I don't know whether anyone else has noticed this, but
that sounds idealistic to me. But
my computer, my Gmail has gone through some kind of evolution in that it's always offered responses.
Right.
But now that they are so accurate, I don't understand how it's working. I mean, it seems to use language that isn't in the email I'm replying to, and it seems to know exactly what I'm going to say. And obviously, it is scary and it makes you feel totally redundant. As you say, how new forms of intimacy with ourselves and others that are going to be enabled by these kinds of prostheses, how we make them productive and not simply
the entire feeling of alienation may vanish. You know, we may just wake up every day and get all of the data that we need and feel, I'm in touch with all the people I love.
Well, we'll come back in 20 years if we're both still alive, and we'll see.
I doubt I'll be here, but
we'll see how it's gone.
Right. So next,
Gary, thank you. That was really great.
I'll let somebody else have a question, please.
Right. So the next question is by Shayan Bhattacharya. Shayan, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, Asijit. So I was wondering, when I asked the question, I intended to ask you whether the novel as a form still retains its vitality to let us engage with these questions. And after your talk, I I think that question has been kind of made redundant, but let me slightly modify that question. What is it about the novel form, that blurring that you described between reality and its representation? So is it narrative or is it language? And I'm asking this question. I'm thinking of in the late 20th century, from the mid 20th century, the cinema starts becoming very, very, very predominant, and some people would say that the film occupies the role that the novel had in the 19th century, and now we have technologies of virtual reality and multiplayer games, and that blurring seems to happen in a new kind of way, the blurring between reader and writer, when you have multiple people engaged in creating worlds and interacting with each other. I'm not a very partisan of these things. I don't play these games at all, but I have a curiosity about them. So I'm wondering, do you see any possibility for these new technologies to expand our explorations of these, these very productive questions having to do with the sort of playfulness having to do with reality and its representation, and sort of flipping back and forth between these ambiguities.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think my feeling on this question has changed a little over recent years, and I used to feel absolutely sanguine about the future of the novel, and maybe I feel a bit less sanguine now than I did. But the novel is a very adaptive and a very persistent technology. And there's something peculiar about it, that its adaptability, its persistence, has always sat with the sense that it's nearly over, it's nearly done. And if you look at the history of the novel, throughout the history of the novel, from the very first days that we used that terminology, practitioners of the novel, critics of the novel, have said it's about to die. I mean, it always feels like it's about to die. It always feels like it's out of step with the technologies that surround it. Even in the height of its world-making power in the 19th century, there were plenty of people writing essays called "The Novel is Dead" or "The Death of the Novel." It always has had that about it, that it feels like it's living just at the edge of its time. Now, of course, we are living at a very challenging time for all of our cultural forms at the moment, and so my sort of, I don't want to feel complacent that the novel will simply carry on as it is, unaffected by the shifts around us that you described. But I think it's interesting that the sense that we all had that printed books were going to become entirely replaced by ebooks. I mean, that hasn't happened. We reach a point where people stop buying ebooks and start buying print books again, because it's an incredibly good technology. It's also, you sit on any train, you sit in any cafe, you go to any public place and look around you, and people are reading novels. I mean, it's just not a dying form, even though it feels precarious. I mean, maybe it feels necessarily precarious, but in terms of giving an account of the way that we experience inner consciousness, the novel is a very, very difficult formal technology and technological form to beat. So I kind of think it's here with us for a while.
Thank you, Shayan. So the next question is from Shutirtho. Shutirtho, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Just have time for a couple of more questions. Shutirtho, you can unmute yourself if you're there. I can see you in the participant. Otherwise, I'll read your question out. Okay, I'll just read his question out. Shudito is asking, what is your take on the transhumanist desire to separate the mind from the body, which seems to be a favorite trope in several science fiction novels? Does this risk affecting identity as we know it by separating being in a mind or body dualism? Are there any possible ramifications of the same?
It's a good question. Maybe I need to know which novels you're thinking of.
Shudito, can you type it out, which novels you're specifically referring to? Because one example is, of course, what Professor Boxall referred to is 0K by DeLillo. Something that comes to your mind is Winterson's Frankenstein. But which one are you referring to? Do you have?
Or I mean, if you haven't got any in mind, I mean, we can try and sort of think about.
I think he just wrote it's Asimov's novels as a foundation. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe like you, I'm very fascinated by Asimov, and I think his depictions of robot consciousness are incredibly influential, and incredibly influential in thinking or rethinking the mind-body connection. My sense is that from Asimov to Ishiguro, we're not seeing the novel imagine a consciousness that isn't embodied, but rather seeing that technological changes mean that the way that we experience embodiment change. So I mean, that would be my response to your question, that no, we don't escape a mind-body dualism. We just imagine the materializing of consciousness in different ways. And the other thing that's influencing this, of course, is climate change, which perhaps it was in there in your last question, Asijit, but perhaps the dominant force that changes the way that we imagine how consciousness relates to materiality is the fact that human consciousness and the attempt to imprint a human sort of life world onto the environment has produced this incredible disaster. I mean, and what we're seeing is a kind of blowback here, where materiality is asserting its independence of mind, or at least making us reconceive how mind and environment relate to one another.
Right.
That would be my response. So Toto, I don't know.
Right. Yeah. So the last question is by Ogni Broto Chaudhuri. So he's asking. So it's a kind of challenge question, sort of, to your book. So he's asking. So when we are actually viewing the novel as a sort of prosthesis, or maybe even an augmentation, an extension of our body and mind, are we in any way lessening its appeal as a popular literary form by this unique interpretation? So what effects do you feel can take place in the potential reader's mind when they view this literary form through this new perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, a nice way to finish the conversation. I'm going to sidestep the question of pleasure a little bit, because it's something that all of us who work as critics or work with literature are asked all the time. When you're thinking about literature, does it stop being popular or entertaining? And I think that there is no difference for me between reading a book critically and reading it for pleasure. The two things are entirely the same. The other part of your question, you know, how does reading the novel as a prosthetic change the way that a novel works? And I suppose my answer to that is that it helps us. It comes back to my last answer to your question, Asijit, that it helps us to see that the novel has always been rethinking or pushing at the limits of how we think about the way that we meet with our material selves and our material environment. And it hasn't always been easy to see that the novel is doing that. And by re-seeing the novel, or by recovering the persistence and imaginative originality with which the novel over its entire history has met with its material instantiations, worked at them, transformed them, it helps us to see newly how powerful this form has been, both in making the world that we live in and in giving us the imaginative and intellectual apparatuses to remake it. I mean, as we're facing the predicament that Jerry so eloquently put before us, where we're going to become algorithms. The imaginative mode that the novel is and will be is one way of engaging with enormous amounts of friction with these material and political and technological contexts, so that we can try to make the world a better place.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Boxall, for your reflections on prosthesis, mimesis, and novels, much more as biological extensions than we imagine them to be. So I really hope we'll have such sessions with you in the near future. And thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for being so patient and cooperative.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yes. Yeah. See you. Bye-bye.